An anti-austerity party wins out in Greece and immediately takes on Brussels, with calls to get others in the continent to follow their lead. Ukraine endures one of the bloodiest weeks since conflict began, with dozens of civilians killed by artillery barrages, some waiting to receive humanitarian aid. Plus, the personal accounts from Auschwitz survivors and declassified documents revealing the scale of Nazi Holocaust atrocities there at the 70th anniversary of the death camp's liberation by the Red Army. Hello, these are the day's headlines and the week's top stories. This is the Weekly here on RT International. One of Europe's most struggling nations found its voice over the past 7 days when Greece's newly elected government swept in and immediately sent shivers through the bloc's paymasters.
The verdict of the Greek people ends beyond all doubt the vicious circle of austerity in our country. It annuls in an indisputable fashion the bailout agreements and renders the Troika a thing of the past.
Well, Syriza's key promise to put an end to the years of austerity policies from the previous government saw voters swing to the left to give the party a clear mandate a week ago. Since the first bailout in 2010, Greece has been forced to slash public workers' salaries and pensions by more than 40%. Thousands of public facilities have since closed due to a lack of cash. As a result, over the last 5 years, the number of jobless people in Greece doubled. The country's newly appointed finance minister insists Greece will not cooperate with the troika of lenders or accept any extension to its bailout package. Euro MP Markus Pretzel from the Alternative for Germany party believes it's impossible for his country to get its money back.
It's always the Greek people who have to repay their debt. And if they don't, we won't send our military to get back our money. So it's Angela Merkel's problem to get back the German taxpayers' money, and she won't. It's just not possible. So they can renegotiate it. That would be the best way for Europe. But if they don't renegotiate, they just stop the payment, and everything will go its way. The euro will collapse, that's for sure.
And here is what's at stake for Greece. Its public debt, which Syriza wants to renegotiate, amounts to hundreds of billions of euros. It equates to every Greek citizen owing about 34,000 euros each and works out to a whopping 175% of the country's GDP. Well, the decisive moves being made in Athens are at odds with the EU leadership. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has ruled out cancelling any of Greece's debt. Finland's Prime Minister also refuses to forgive the loan, while one EU central bank policymaker called on Greece to play fair. A professor of finance and economic policy at the Technical University of Berlin told us that Greece should not blackmail its EU helping hand.
What is simply the problem in Greece? That there is a total refusal of reform. And they really think that they have such a potential to cause collateral damage within the Eurozone. I tell you, blackmailing must never pay off. And if that means the end of the membership of Greece within the European community, I say, okay, they can have their own way. We are going to build Europe without Greece, but we are not going to accept blackmailing methods.
Well, Syriza's first week has seen it cause political as well as economic headaches for the EU. Greece threw a spanner in the works earlier this week when the EU announced members were unanimously considering new sanctions on Russia, blaming it for the recent deadly attacks in eastern Ukraine. Athens, though, says they weren't actually asked if they agreed. Reaction from the other EU nations was swift. During an emergency meeting, the bloc's foreign ministers eventually held back from widening the sanctions, choosing instead to extend the current ones, something Athens was quick to claim as its own diplomatic victory. One of the Syriza party's Euro MPs says the EU is malfunctioning.
The new Greek Prime Minister was never asked for his consent. And this is malfunctioning of the European institutions. You can't issue an announcement in the name of all member states without having consulted the newly elected Prime Minister of Greece. Greece is a member state, as far as I know. We think that there has been a unilateral approach condemning Russia, not based on true facts.
Well, the EU's most powerful might be feeling rankled right now, but Syriza's victory seems to be inspiring people in other countries who are growing tired of bearing the austerity burden. Well, this is Madrid on Saturday, where tens of thousands gathered to support the anti-bailout Podemos party. They chanted the leader's name as he took to the stage. The year-old movement is rapidly winning over voters with its promise to revive Spain's economy. International affairs analyst Sergej Trifkovic told us that he expects we're seeing in Spain and Greece will echo across the EU.
It's very difficult in the EU to be the first country to break the ranks. Now that the Greeks have made the move, I confidently expect that the Hungarians in particular, but perhaps also Slovakia and Cyprus, will find it easier to garner courage and to say no to the dictate from Brussels. And that once you have the first voice, that maybe some other countries will follow suit.
In other news, Auschwitz is one of the most chillingly distinctive names remembered from the Nazi Holocaust horror. On Tuesday, the world commemorated the anniversary of the liberation of the Third Reich's largest extermination camp. Well, 70 years ago, Soviet troops saved around 7,000 prisoners at Auschwitz. Around 300 of those survivors joined the commemoration ceremony this week at the site in southern Poland. Here are some of their accounts.
When the train door opened, we saw huge flames above the chimneys. We smelled a suffocating, strange odour. We didn't realise that human bodies were being burned there.
If people don't know what really happened there, they won't notice if one day it happens again.
In the barrack building where I found myself, I saw dozens of women. But I didn't know if they were women or other beings, dressed in dirty shirts, bald-headed, lying on 3 levels of beds and crying. I thought, this is what hell must look like.
Well, Auschwitz was the largest of the Nazi death camps and part of a much wider network operated during the Second World War. Hitler's regime ran it for 5 years in Nazi-occupied Poland. More than 1 million people, mostly European Jews, perished there. Some suffocated in the gas chambers. Others died through starvation, forced labour, disease, or after being subjected to gruesome medical experiments. Russia declassified documents about the Auschwitz liberation this week. Here are some extracts.
When we couldn't work anymore, the guard would beat us. Many couldn't take it and took their lives at the first possible opportunity.
In summer, we could hardly breathe through all the smoke from the burning dead bodies.
Obersturmführer Hoffmann used to say that the prisoner who lives longer than 3 months is a criminal because he's stealing from others.
Well, in Berlin, an exhibition's open to commemorate the youngest victims called Don't Forget Our Names, the Children of Auschwitz. RT asked some of the survivors who were at the launch how they felt as they were freed and what lessons the world should have learned.
Of course, we were happy, but I was at that time, I was so weak that I wasn't able to go somewhere.
The world needs to know, if we don't want a repetition of those kinds of events, that we must inform people all over the world what transpired during the war, during Hitler's times.
Well, world leaders also descended on the former site of Auschwitz to mark Holocaust Memorial Day, although Poland credited Ukrainian soldiers, not the multinational Soviet forces, for liberating the concentration camp. We asked the director of the leading Jewish human rights organisation, the Simon Wiesenthal Centre, why Warsaw might have made such a statement.
I think that a large part of this is the ongoing efforts, systematic efforts, by the post-communist Eastern European countries to try and rewrite the narrative of World War II and the Holocaust in order to hide the crimes of local Nazi collaborators, mass murder, and to promote a false equivalency between communist and Nazi crimes. And it was only by the cooperation between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies that Nazi Germany was ultimately defeated. So that's the lesson of World War II. And that's the lesson of the liberation of Auschwitz. And unfortunately, that lesson was not sufficiently emphasized, and the fact that Putin was not invited only made it worse.
Well, to pay his tribute, President Putin visited the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow. The Russian leader met with survivors and war veterans. Up to 3 million Jews were slaughtered by Nazi troops during the occupation of Soviet territory. Still to come, the religious intensity in Britain that's got vigilante patrols out in the capital. Groups from several faiths have taken to guarding the streets because of security fears, but it's certainly not a joint effort, as we report later. Frenzied fighting raged throughout the week in eastern Ukraine in what could be the biggest military operation by anti-government forces there. They say they've got at least 8,000 Ukrainian troops surrounded and at their mercy. They've offered Kiev's forces the chance to surrender and say some have already done so. One anti-government forces commander says almost 1,500 Ukrainian soldiers have died in the past fortnight, but that number cannot be independently verified. The Ukrainian army denies that, saying they've got the situation under control and are far from losing the battle. Well, the fighting is focused here, around a local railway hub north of Donetsk. In the regional capital itself, entire neighbourhoods have been devastated by barrages from what the self-proclaimed authorities say is Kiev's artillery. RT's Roman Kosarev is there.
Here in Donetsk, there hasn't been a single day this week without grim news of civilian deaths. The rumble of artillery is heard here non-stop, hitting mostly in the north and the northwest of the city. And those are residential areas, by the way, and every volley hits a bus stop, a market or a playground. And the most optimistic casualty counts put civilian deaths in the city and the surrounding areas at over 100 during the past 2 weeks. Locals say this Friday was one of the bloodiest days since the start of the fighting, with at least 12 victims, and 5 of them were killed as they were picking up humanitarian aid. And that marked the first time an aid distribution point ended up under fire. Anti-government forces say the city is being shelled from a neutral area, which is frequently used as a foothold by the Ukrainian army. Kiev, in turn, denies those claims, blaming the self-proclaimed authorities for the destruction of civilian areas.
Well, even far from the front line, many Ukrainians are having tough times living under an economic crisis. Well, this was Kiev on Wednesday, where up to 1,000 miners protested against the privatisation of the country's coal industry. They marched on a government building, angered by the authorities' plan to reduce support for the industry. That's just part of the austerity budget passed late last year, which included spending cuts, tax hikes and public sector layoffs. It's estimated that Kiev needs at least $15 billion to avoid default this year. The country's debt is already over 70% of its GDP. Last year, inflation soared to 25%, although this week Kiev did get $2 billion loans from the United States and the EU. As for Kiev's other lender, the International Monetary Fund, it wants the situation in the country stabilised before it provides more support. Well, political commentator Anna Van Densky believes all of Ukraine's troubles boil down to NATO's expansionist ambitions.
The whole situation of conflict in Ukraine is a direct result of enlargement policy of NATO that started at Bucharest summit in 2008. Then NATO openly declared that their aim is to include Georgia and Ukraine. So they are doing their best to embrace these two countries in their ranks. It would be very easy for the West, who is helping Ukraine with this financial aid, to impose peace, but they are not doing that. As we see, President Poroshenko gets indulgence after indulgence for whatever his National Guards do in the Donbas region. Western values that are so highly praised are just a fiction. They are applicable only to Ukrainians, but not to the Donbas people. Well,
when it comes to bringing peace in Ukraine, Moscow's again being blamed for a lack of progress. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe has extended its ban on Russia's voting rights, prompting a furious exit by the country's delegation. We'll explain that to you in a few minutes. Also claimed that Islamic State backers may be funneling money to the terrorists through the United States.